Thank you for choosing American Pest CEUs.
Hello everyone, Sean Reeves with American Pest CEUs. I'm an associate certified entomologist and I've been in the pest management industry since 1999.
Today's course is on the Core Manual, Chapter 1, Pest Management. After taking this chapter, you should be able to define pest, state the four main groups of pest and give an example of each, discuss the importance of pest identification and pest control, list 6 general pest management methods, define integrated pest management or IPM, list 5 benefits of using IPM, discuss how using one or more control options can improve pest control, describe how selectivity and persistence affect chemical controls, explain how pest population levels trigger control procedures, distinguish between prevention and suppression when developing pest management goals, give several reasons why pesticide applications may fail, explain the importance of a pesticide's mode of action in managing pesticide resistance, list 2 tactics that will minimize the development of pesticide resistance. Pest problems throughout history. Civilization has been combating insects and other pests throughout history. Perhaps the most infamous human catastrophe was the Black Plague of Europe, when millions of people in the 14th century died from a mysterious scourge. Centuries later, it was determined that the cause was a bacterial disease spread by rat fleas. When rats, the normal host animals, were unavailable as a food source, the fleas sought other warm-blooded hosts, including humans. Although the plague is still present in parts of the world today, controlling rats, other rodents, and fleas can greatly reduce disease incidence. The destruction of Ireland's potato crop by a fungal disease in the 19th century directly affected the population of the United States. Late blight essentially eliminated potatoes, the staple food crop of Ireland. Potatoes not destroyed in the field rotted in storage during the winter. Thousands of Irish starved in the resulting famine, and more than 1 million migrated to the United States. Late blight continues to be a major problem of potatoes, but today it is managed through the use of resistant cultivars, proper sanitation practices, and fungicides. This was very interesting to me when I first read this because my family actually did immigrate to the United States from Ireland due to the potato famine. It's amazing the impact that pests can have on our lives, especially things like crops. Now, obviously, we've gotten much better as the years have gone on. We have a lot more practices, which you're learning about here in this course. Also, we have pesticides and things like that. But just to think, back in those days, people just died. I mean, when the food crop was attacked and it got destroyed, there was no food. That was it. You either had to go somewhere else or die. Malaria is a disease caused by the transmission of a parasitic microorganism, protozoan, by mosquitoes when they feed on humans. Historians credit malaria with altering the patterns of human history and causing the collapse of some civilizations. During World War II, 500,000 soldiers were infected in the South Pacific and African theaters, with 60,000 deaths recorded. In 2010, malaria cases numbered 219 million, with 660,000 people dying from this debilitating disease. Anti-malarial drugs, insecticide applications, environmental modifications, and mosquito bed nets have brought great improvements to fighting this difficult-to-control disease. So when we talk about mosquitoes, and especially malaria, it's amazing the impact it's had on human history, alternating the patterns of where people lived, even collapsing civilizations. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable when you think about it. So I would definitely say that mosquitoes are public enemy number 1. In a lot of countries, you still have issues with malaria. And even if you travel from places like the United States or other developed countries, you really have to get the anti-malarial shot before you go, because if not, you could come down sick, and that's definitely not something you want to deal with. Outbreaks of the native mountain pine beetle in the western United States and Canada in the early 21st century destroyed more than 4 million acres of lodgepole, ponderosa, Scots, and limber pines. Accidental introduction of the emerald ash borer from Asia during the same period has destroyed millions of ash trees in the Midwestern United States. Preventative insecticidal treatments are being used to manage these two destructive beetles. The emerald ash borer was a very interesting insect to me. When I was growing up, I heard a lot about it. People would have ash trees all over their towns and communities, and then this pest came through and it just decimated them. So these invasive species are a really big deal, and the reality is when something gets introduced to an area that's not used to having it, it can really wreak havoc on the ecosystem. And in this case, most of the ash trees that were in the Midwest have now been decimated and they're just gone. So there's a real reality of what these insects are able to do. The introduction of one species like this that's not native can be a really big deal to an ecosystem in an area. These examples illustrate the enormity and complexity of pest problems, but what is a pest? A pest is an undesirable organism that injures humans, desirable plants and animals, manufactured products, or natural substances. Many insects, pathogens, disease-causing organisms, such as viruses, bacteria or fungi, plants known as weeds, mollusks, slugs and snails, fish, birds, and a variety of mammals from mice to deer, compete for our crops and livestock. In addition, some pests destroy clothing, furniture, and buildings, reduce the beauty and recreational value of the landscape, and invade our homes during the winter months. As the battle between humans and pests continues over time, so will innovative methods of control. And you need to understand what a pest is by definition. Again, a pest is an undesirable organism that injures humans, desirable plants and animals, manufactured products, or natural substances. So keep in mind there can be a lot of different things that are pests, which you can see up above. But the reality is you need to know how to define a pest. Any of you taking a core exam? Because if you don't, you're going to get those questions wrong on the exam. Pest control over the years. For many centuries, the causes of crop failures and human and animal diseases were shrouded in mystery. The first pest control measures were crude, weeds were pulled, rats were clubbed, and beetles were plucked from foliage. Other ancient, non-chemical control methods included burning to control weeds, diseases, and insects, 950 BC, Egyptians placing fish nets overbed to prevent mosquito bites, 440 BC, and Romans using rat-proof grain storage bins, 13 BC. The first known use of natural enemies is credited to Arabian growers, 1000 AD. Arab farmers moved colonies of a predaceous ant species from nearby mountains to an oasis to control pest ants that were damaging their date palms. This example of the Arabian growers moving the ants from the mountains to the oasis to control the pest ants is a great example of biological control. The earliest use of chemicals as pesticides dates back to 2500 BC, when the Sumerians used sulfur compounds to control mites and insects. The Chinese used mercury and arsenic compounds in 500 BC to control body lice. Early plant-derived insecticides included hellebore to control body lice, nicotine to control aphids, and pyrethrins to control a wide variety of insects. In France, during the late 19th century, a farmer sprayed a mixture of lime and copper sulfate on grapevines to deter passers-by from picking the grapes. The farmer found that the mixture also controlled downy mildew, a serious fungal disease of grapes. Later named Bordeaux mixture, it remains a widely used fungicide worldwide. Until the 1940s, pest control chemicals were derived from plants and inorganic compounds. During World War II, the synthetic chemical DDT saved many Allied soldiers from insect-transmitted diseases. Synthetic pesticides launched the modern-day chemical industry and a new era in pest control. Pesticides became the primary means of solving pest problems because they were effective, relatively inexpensive, provided season-long crop protection, and could be used with fertilizers and other production practices. Modern pesticides achieved wide acceptance following their successful use in agriculture and for human health. Obviously, back in the 1940s, DDT was a synthetic pesticide that came out that was really effective in controlling mosquitoes. This was a big help for the Allied soldiers and people around the world in stopping malaria that was transmitted by mosquitoes. Today, these synthetic insecticides are typically known as pyrethroids, so you're going to hear a lot about pyrethroids, but that's what they are. They're a synthetic insecticide. In recent years, however, some drawbacks of heavy dependence on pesticides have become increasingly apparent. Pesticide resistance to DDT was documented in 1947. Since that time, hundreds of insects have become resistant to one or more pesticides. Most notable is the Colorado potato beetle, which has developed resistance to every major group of insecticides, greatly complicating pest management efforts. Resistance also has arisen in many weeds and plant pathogens in agricultural production. The longer you're in pest control, the more you're going to hear about this resistance to pesticides. It's a really big thing. Obviously, as insects have become more resistant to one or more pesticides, as we've talked about here, that's a major problem. So you're going to learn more about like rotating products and things like that. Because when you use the same product over and over again, insects can build a resistance, and maybe you kill 98% of the population, but the problem is that 2% that lives is resistant, and then they pass those genes on to future generations. So resistance can be a major problem, and you can have almost these superbugs or insects that are completely resistant to one type of a product. The impact of increasing pesticide use on the environment was graphically illustrated in 1962 by Rachel Carson. Her book, Silent Spring, focused on DDT and other chlorinated hydrocarbons because of their long residual activity and persistence in the environment. Although these characteristics contributed to their effectiveness, chlorinated hydrocarbons also accumulated in the fatty tissue of some animals, especially those higher in the food chain, bioaccumulation. In certain situations, some organisms accumulated chemical residues in higher concentrations than those found in the food organisms they consumed, biomagnification. I just want to say this, when it comes to bioaccumulation and biomagnification, these types of things are typically on all core exams, so this is a good thing for you to know as a pest control person in general. But also you need to understand the difference between bioaccumulation and biomagnification and how that works. As we talk more about this, ecologists refer to a food chain as a sequence of animals feeding in the natural environment where a particular plant, animal, or microorganism is eaten by an animal that is in turn eaten by another animal. Animals at each level normally consume individuals from the previous level. Organisms with pesticides in their tissues are eaten by fish, which are in turn eaten by birds. The birds at the top of the food chain accumulate the highest concentration of pesticide residues. What we're describing at the end of this slide is biomagnification. Basically, it's magnifying the accumulation of the pesticides that have worked their way up the food chain. So the birds at the top experience the most biomagnification, or the highest concentration of the pesticide residues. Since the publication of Silent Spring, the United States has experienced a level of environmental awareness unequal to any other period in history. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was created in 1970 by Congress to implement laws passed to protect the environment and the health of humans and other animals. In 1972, EPA banned the use of DDT in the United States. Regulatory action has since been taken against many chemicals thought to pose significant environmental and health hazards. There's two main points in this slide that you want to remember. The fact that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, was created in 1970 by Congress, and also in 1972, the EPA banned the use of DDT in the United States. This was a really big action at the time, and something that was very important because the pesticide was doing a lot of damage to much of the ecosystem in the U.S., so this was really pivotal when it came to protecting the environment at the time. Pest recognition. There are four main groups of pest organisms: weeds, invertebrate animals, pathogens, and vertebrate animals. Never classify an organism as a pest until it is clearly determined to be one. Be certain any injury or observed damage is actually due to the identified organism and not to some other cause. Some plants, for example, can be damaged by factors in the environment. These factors include weather extremes, air pollutants, road salt, and inadequate or excessive fertilization. This damage may be mistaken for that caused by living pests. Some of the good information on this slide, again, is you being able to identify what are pests. What are the four main groups: the weeds, the invertebrate animals, pathogens, and vertebrate animals. Obviously, you need to know if something is a pest. So, for example, there's a lot of environmental factors that can look like pest damage but aren't. You look at different things like excessive fertilization. That could look like pest damage when in reality it's not pest damage at all, it's an environmental factor. So you need to understand and be able to identify the difference between pest damage and environmental factors. Identify. The first step in pest management is to accurately identify the pest. Once the pest is identified, applicators can learn about its life cycle, behavior, characteristic damage, factors that favor its development, susceptible life stages, and known control method. Misidentification and lack of accurate information could cause pest control failure. So the reality is, if you don't identify the pest correctly, you're never going to solve the problem. I don't think there's anything more important that we do in pest management than identifying the pest. We talked about, is it a pest, is it an environmental issue, and if it is a pest, what type of pest is it? So those of you that become really good at identifying pests are going to have a much easier time in this career than if you don't understand how to identify them. You'll waste a lot of time, money, and effort trying to figure something out through misidentification than you would have if you identified the pest correctly up front and then made the service plan based on that identification. So that takes us to another great question. How do I identify pests? Ways to identify pests. To identify an organism, consult reference manuals, identification books, extension bulletins, field guides, and online identification keys that contain pictures and biological information. If you cannot pinpoint a specific plant or animal, take or send the specimen to a university diagnostic lab or a local pest management specialist. Collect several specimens if possible. Ask the specialist to recommend the best way to collect and send samples. I can tell everyone here, having been in the pest management industry since 1999, I do love identification references. I've had a lot of different field guides, even the extension bulletins, and use online regularly, especially insect keys that are really helpful. You can also use things like Google Lens nowadays to kind of update this. You just have to be careful because you really have to understand the photos you're looking at on there really do match what you're looking at. But just keep in mind that you need to use these identification tools at different times. And of course, you can always take a vial with some alcohol and send it to a university lab because obviously this is what they do. So they're definitely going to be really good at identifying things. And sometimes you need a little extra help. And again, this is something very important because you do need to identify each pest. It may be difficult to identify small insects and most mites, nematodes, and plant pathogens. Accurate identification requires the use of a hand lens or microscope, special tests, or careful damage analysis. Often the pest host, the animal or plant on which an organism lives, and location are important clues in making a correct identification. There's a couple great takeaways on this slide. First, you have to understand that the host, the animal or plant on which the organism lives, is a really big deal. Obviously, if you're looking at certain things like certain types of plants, you would understand that aphids feed on them. That makes it a lot easier to identify the fact that aphids are feeding on the plant. Whereas also the location is a big deal. So you need to know your location, right? You need to understand what you're looking at, what is the location, and that'll tell you more about what the pest is. As far as if you're looking at something out in a lawn, that's doing visible damage to it, you know you need to be thinking more about a lawn and ornamental pest than something you would see inside a house just based on the damage in the two different environments. Pest species have different physical forms depending on the life cycle stage or time of the year. Weed seedlings, for example, often do not resemble the mature plant. Many insect species undergo changes in appearance as they develop from eggs through immature stages to the adult form. Let's talk about the four main groups of pests. 1, we're going to have weeds, undesirable plants. 2, invertebrates, insects, mites, ticks, spiders, snails, and slugs. 3, disease agents or pathogens, bacteria, viruses, fungi, nematodes, roundworms, mycoplasma, parasitic microorganisms, and other microorganisms. 4, vertebrates, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and rodents, and other mammals. So there again, something else you're going to want to know is understanding what the four groups of pests are. Now some of these things you would understand, like weeds and the undesirable plants, insects, things like that, everybody knows. Even vertebrates, birds, reptiles, amphibians can all be problems. Rodents, obviously. When it comes to disease agents or pathogens, just understand that the bacteria, the viruses, the fungi, nematodes, all these types of things, they are considered pests as well. So if you ever see a question on this in an exam anywhere, you'll understand that those are also part of the classification of the four main pest groups. Let's talk about characteristic damage. Pests may leave signs of their presence or damage that will help you determine what they are. Birds and rodents often build characteristic nests. The types of feeding, damage, and excrement can help you identify many insects. Burrows, gnaw marks, tracks, trails in grass, and/or feces are often characteristic of certain mammals. Weeds may have unique flowers, seeds, or fruits, or unusual growth habits. Fungi and other pathogens often cause specific types of damage, deformation, or color changes in host tissues. So again, as we talk about this type of characteristic damage, you need to understand the different characteristics of bird nest or burrows and gnaw marks from rats. You need to be able to understand what different types of weeds look like. You also need to be able to identify feces of pests. You need to understand the different types of feces. If you're ever going to become good at identification, you have to be able to figure these things out, because pests are always going to leave something behind that helps you identify them. But if you don't understand what you're looking at, you're never going to win the identification battle. Here's something else you definitely want to understand: pest management methods. We're going to have natural and applied controls. So first, we're going to have biological control. Second, chemical control. 3, cultural control. 4, genetic control. 5, mechanical and physical controls. One thing you guys are probably noticing as you go through this course is we have numbers on the screen. Like here, there's a number 5. The point of this number 5 is to help you remember that there's 5 pest management methods, as you've seen on the screen as we just talked about. It's something that I think helps you go, okay, when I think about pest management methods, I remember that number 5. So I always tell people when you're going through a course like this, try to remember some of the numbers and how they correlate to different topics in the course. Pest management methods. Once a pest problem is identified, you can begin planning how to manage the pest. Determine what management methods are available and the benefits and limitations of each. Select methods that are most effective in controlling the pests, yet the least harmful to people and the environment. To summarize this slide and kind of give you some words to work with, just remember, as you see at the top of the slide, identify, make a plan, and then figure out what method you're going to use to control the pest. And always remember, you want to use something that protects people and the environment. You'll always hear me say this. When I say people and the environment, that means you, because you're the applicator. So you definitely want to make sure that you're protecting yourself as much as everything else around you. We also need to talk about abiotic factors. Abiotic factors are natural control measures within the environment that injure or destroy plants and animals, including pests. They include climatic factors, e.g. wind, temperature, sunshine and rain, air or water pollution, and topographic features, rivers, lakes, and mountains, that can affect pest movement. If such natural controls do not hold pests in check, humans must intervene and apply pest management tactics. Applied controls include biological, chemical, cultural, genetic, mechanical physical, and regulatory methods. Biological control. In an undisturbed ecosystem, most organisms have one or more natural enemies or competitors to keep them from developing into large, damaging populations. When an organism is removed from one ecosystem to another, this natural check and balance is disturbed. The organism can become a pest in new geographical area, especially when its natural enemies do not accompany it to its new location. So if we were really to break this down a little bit further, if you think about it, we would just use biological control for everything if it wasn't for the fact that when you do bring a species into an ecosystem that's not been there before, it has no natural enemies, so it has the ability to wreak havoc on the ecosystem. So the idea of biological control can be good, but it can also cause a major problem because there is no checks and balances in the ecosystem at that point. One pest method involves reuniting the introduced pest with its natural enemies. Biological control is the use of natural enemies, predators, parasites, pathogens, and competitors to control pests and their damage. These biological biocontrol agents, are being used successfully to manage certain insect, mite, fungal, fish, and weed pests. Once suitable natural enemies from the native home of an introduced pest are located, extensive testing and evaluation are necessary to ensure that these natural enemies will not become pests themselves in the new environment. Laws and regulations strictly controlled the importation of all organisms, including biological control agents, into the United States. The selected natural enemies are imported, reared, and released. If successful, these biocontrol agents become established within large areas. Over time, they will lower target pest populations for long periods with no further human intervention. A second biological control technique is the mass release of large numbers of natural enemies into fields, orchards, greenhouses, or other locations to control specific pests. Because this method usually does not yield long-term results, the natural enemies must be released periodically. For example, predatory mites are used to control plant-feeding spider mites. Parasitic wasps are used to manage specific pests, while praying manids, lady beetles, and lacewings are used as general predators in a garden or greenhouse. Nematodes and fungi are being studied as biological control agents for certain weeds and insects. Another aspect of biological control is to maintain healthy populations of native natural enemies. This could mean planting crops or ground covers to ensure a diverse plant community of pollen, nectar sources for adult insects. This method also requires careful selection and use of pesticides that are less toxic to natural enemies. Additionally, applicators should apply pesticides at lower than label rates if recommended and effective to lessen the impact on natural enemies. I want to make a point here when we're talking about this type of biological control, especially the healthy populations of the native natural enemies. This can be a great idea. You just have to remember a couple things. You don't want these enemies to take over. You don't want them to overpopulate. But also you got to think about if you're still putting out pesticides, how can we keep these natural enemies alive? So you have to look at the label. The label's the law on every pesticide. But if you can use a lower than label rate, if it's recommended and effective, and it lessens the impact on those natural enemies, it can be a good thing for your overall IPM program. Our next pest management method is going to be an applied control, a chemical control. Chemical control is a pest management method that involves using naturally derived and/or synthetic chemicals to manage pests. These chemicals are often called pesticides. A pesticide is defined as any material that is applied to plants, soil, water, harvested crops, structures, clothing, and furnishings or animals to kill, attract, repel, or regulate, or interrupt the growth and mating of pests, or to regulate plant growth. As many of you know, chemical control is the go-to for a lot of pest management companies. Unfortunately, it really shouldn't be, but that's just the reality of the industry. Now, these types of chemicals can be naturally derived, say from crushed chrysanthemum flower petals, things like that, or synthetic chemicals, as we've talked about earlier in the course, pyrethroids. Basically, you just need to understand that whether it's natural or a synthetic chemical, this is going to be called a pesticide. And just so you know, the true definition, again, it's going to be applied to plants, soil, water, all the things you see down at the bottom. So anytime you see this on an exam or anything, just understand the definition of a pesticide and the types of things that it's applied to. Pesticides often play a key role in pest management programs and may often be the only known control method for a given pest. Major benefits associated with the use of pesticides are their effectiveness, the speed and ease of controlling pests, and their reasonable cost compared with other control options. Pesticides include a wide assortment of chemicals with specialized names and functions. Inasmuch as I do like to use several different tactics when I'm trying to manage pests, pesticides definitely have their place. I don't think we should just indiscriminately go everywhere and just spray all the time, but I also understand that they do have ease of use, they're not that expensive, and they can be quite effective. You just really have to understand to be careful when you're using them. It's important to note they are often grouped according to the type of pests they control. Avicides control or repel pest birds, bactericides control bacteria, chemosterilants sterilize insects and pest vertebrates, defoliants cause leaves, foliage to drop from plants, desiccants promote drying or loss of moisture from plant tissues and insects, disinfectants, antimicrobials control microorganisms, fungicides control fungi, growth regulators alter the growth or development of a plant or animal. Continuing our talk on pesticide groups, herbicides control weeds, insecticides control insects and related arthropods, miticides or acaricides control mites, molluscicides control snails and slugs, nematicides control nematodes, roundworms, ovicides destroy eggs, pheromones attract insects, piscicides control pest fish, predicides control predatory vertebrates, e.g. coyotes, repellents repel insects, mites, ticks, pest vertebrates, invertebrates, birds, and mammals, rodenticides control rodents. Each group of pesticides includes several classes or families. For example, the classes of insecticides include the organophosphates, organochlorines, carbamates, pyrethroids, botanicals, insecticidal soaps, and microbials, among others. The pesticide within a particular class have similar chemical structures or properties, or share a common mode of action, how they kill the pest, or site of action, the specific biological system affected within the pest. The various classes of chemicals work in different ways and present different risks and problems. It's very important that you understand the mode of action, so as you're looking at each of these different chemical or pesticide classes, they're going to have a different mode of action or how they kill the pest, or even site of actions, the specific biological system affected within the pest. These are very important to note because each one of these classes is going to work a little bit differently on the insects, and that's why some products are more effective on insects than others based on their mode of action. So keep in mind as you go through your pest control career that you need to understand the mode of action for each of these classes of insecticides. Some chemicals are called selective pesticides because they are toxic to some pests but have little or no effect on others. For example, certain selective herbicides control broadleaf weeds but not grasses, and ovicides kill only the eggs of certain insects and mites. In contrast, fumigants are non-selective and will kill a wide variety of pests, fungi, insects, weeds, nematodes, and other organisms. Non-selective herbicides control any susceptible plant given a sufficient dose. This idea of selective pesticides should make sense to you because sometimes you do want a product that can be toxic to some pests but have the little or no effect on others. The simple example given here is that sometimes you would want to put out a certain selective herbicide to control broadleaf weeds but not grasses. Obviously, if you think about it, you don't want to spray something that's going to kill the weeds and the grass because you're defeating the purpose, and then you're going to end up resodding somebody's yard or reseeding, so you're going to have a major issue if you use something that's that much of a broad spectrum that just kills everything. Pesticides may move in various ways after they contact a host. Systemic pesticides are absorbed and translocated within a plant or animal. Systemic herbicides are absorbed through leaves or roots and are then transported within the plant. Similarly, systemic insecticides can be eaten by or injected into livestock to control insect pests. By contrast, contact pesticides are not absorbed by treated plants or animals. These pesticides must directly touch the pest or a site that the pest frequents to be effective. I think the easiest way to describe what we're talking about here is say you put a product on a plant, a systemic insecticide, something that may not kill the plant per se, but is something that if aphids try to feed on the plant, it will kill them. This would be a systemic herbicide that would be really effective on controlling a pest that would feed on the plant. Strangely enough, this can also help you with things like ants, because ants feed on the aphid excrement, the honeydew, so when you control the aphids, in essence, you can help control the ants as well. So there can be multiple effects from one treatment like this, especially these systemic insecticides, but you have to be careful because if these are edible plants, fruits or nuts or anything like that, you don't want to use something systemic because then it's going to be in the fruit itself, and that's not a good thing. Pesticides also vary in their persistence or how long they remain active to control pests. Some residual pesticides control pests for weeks, months, or even years. Others provide only short-term control, sometimes lasting only a few hours. That term persistence is very important in our core studies. So basically what we're talking about is what is the residual of the pesticides. As it talks about here, sometimes they last for weeks, months, or even years. So there's some good things about a persistent pesticide, but there's also some bad things. First and foremost, we like the idea of a persistent residual insecticide because it is going to last longer. The problem is the effects on the environment. So just keep in mind, we're looking for that happy medium where we got a product that lasts, takes care of insects or pests for a while, but also not something that's going to be damaging to the environment because it lasts too long. When we look at cultural controls are practices that reduce pest establishment, reproduction, dispersal, and survival. Cultural practices and sanitation are two examples of cultural control. And that understanding of cultural control, especially when we talk about sanitation, is just something that's very important in pest management. Just thinking about an insect like a German roach, sanitation is huge. You can do all the things in the world you want when it comes to putting out pesticides, but if you don't clean up an area and you're leaving a food source, are you really ever going to solve the problem? Most likely not. That's where a cultural control like sanitation really comes into play and is very helpful in the pest management situation. Many cultural practices affect pest survival. Mowing, irrigation, aeration, and fertilization are all important ways of producing healthy turf and preventing pest buildup and damage. In agricultural production, cultivation, selection of crop plant varieties, timing of planting and harvesting, irrigation management and timing, crop rotation, and the use of trap crops help disease populations of weeds, microorganisms, insects, mites, and other pests. So once again, when it comes to a cultural practice, if you think about this, if you're in the turf side of the business, when you talk about things like mowing, irrigation, aeration, and fertilization, that's going to be important to produce a healthy turf. That's going to help prevent pest buildup. The point we're making here is you're not just dealing with putting a pesticide down, you're actually doing all these other things to build that turf up to make sure that pests can't take a foothold, or it makes it much harder for them to because you have a healthy turf. Cultivation is one of the most important ways to control weeds. It is also used to manage some insects and other soil-inhibiting pests. Plows, disc, mowers, cultivators, and bed conditioners destroy weeds or control their growth. These tools also disrupt soil conditions suitable for survival of some microorganisms and insects. Weeds also can be managed by mulching with plastic straw, shredded bark, or wood chips, and by using cover crops. Most all of you should be familiar with mulch, so this would be a simple way of using cultivation to control weeds by putting some mulch down in a flower bed, or even something like plastic or landscape block kind of does the same thing. Sanitation involves eliminating the necessities important to a pest's survival, such as food, water, or shelter. In crop production, sanitation includes such practices as removing weeds that harbor pests, insects, or rodents, eliminating weed plants before they produce seed, destroying diseased plant, material, or crop residues, and keeping field borers or surrounding areas free of pests and pest breeding sites. The main thing with sanitation, as we talked about earlier, is really making sure we don't give the pests what they need. When you eliminate things like food, water, and shelter, you're really reducing the risk of pests having a good environment where they can thrive. Obviously, any living organism is going to need food, going to need water, and is going to need some type of shelter. For instance, if you're dealing with mice and rats around a property and you remove a lot of the debris around structures, they don't have that shelter area, the chances of you having rats inside the structure become less. Let's think about something like a restaurant. Obviously, as you can imagine, if you've got food debris everywhere, say food debris pushed up under the prep lines, you've got grease and food and cracks and crevices, you've got standing water, something like a German cockroach is going to thrive really well. And why would they even go after the bait? Most of the time when we're doing cockroach services, we're using some sort of a food bait. Well, if they've got a great food source, they've got a great water source, they really don't need to go towards our bait. So keep in mind that sanitation is probably the most important step at certain times like that in controlling the insects. Now you can put out all the products you want. You can make the place glow green, as we used to say back in the day, just come in and nuke it. But the reality is, if you don't use sanitation, you're not going to solve the problem. I would say this as well. A lot of these steps we're talking about here when it comes to sanitation is going to involve the customer themselves. You can't be the one to always clean up and keep up with things. You're not on site all the time. You're going to need good customer cooperation and involvement in this, even if it's residential and, of course, if it's commercial. I mean, if you've got a commercial establishment, they have to have great sanitation practices in place, or you're really going to be fighting a losing battle on getting rid of these insect problems. When we deal with something like animal manure management is an effective sanitation practice used to prevent or reduce fly problems in poultry and livestock operations. Mosquitoes can be controlled by draining standing water. It doesn't necessarily take a rocket scientist to figure out what we're talking about here. But just think about it. If you've got animal manure all over, you've got a farm or whatever the case may be, you're going to have flies. If you've got standing water, you're going to have mosquitoes. That's because we've got food sources, we got breeding grounds, we got all these areas that make it conducive for them to thrive. So that's why we keep hitting these points. You need to understand that you have to reduce these areas. You have to reduce these food areas, you have to reduce these breeding and habitat areas, because if you don't, no matter how many chemicals you put out, you're truly never going to solve that pest control problem. Here's another big one I come across all the time. You need to make sure that you close garbage containers and frequent garbage pickup, eliminate food sources for flies, cockroaches, wasps, and rodents. Removing soil, trash, and wood debris from around and under buildings reduces termite and fungal rot damage. And what we're talking about here is the fact that we need to modify the habitat in these areas. I can't tell you the number of customers I've had through the years that have had open garbage cans or dumpsters wide open behind commercial buildings. They're having these major problems with flies, rats, other insects, and you're looking around the property and you're making these graphs and taking photos and you're going, I see the exact problem. Unfortunately, a lot of customers don't understand this. They're not used to dealing with sanitation, especially on the outside of the property like this. This is where we come in and educate them, but also the habits have to change. Just like I said before, we can't take care of all these problems on our own. Now, if we go under a building like they're talking about here and we see scrap lumber in a crawl space and that's bringing in termites, we understand, okay, there's a food source, we remove this scrap lumber, we treat for the termites, maybe we even lay a vapor barrier to stop some of that condensation moisture from rising from the ground. We can solve that. But just keeping in mind that there's certain things we can do and certain things we can't, and we have to work hand in hand with our customers to make sure we solve a lot of these conditions. Genetic control. Sometimes plants and animals can be bred or selected to resist specific pest problems. For example, certain livestock breeds are selected for physical characteristics that prevent attack by some pests or provide physiological resistance to disease or parasitic organisms. Certain plant varieties are naturally resistant to insects, pathogens, or nematodes. Many plants actually repel various types of pests, and some contain toxic substances. Plant resistance to insect pests can sometimes be achieved by transferring genetic material from certain insect-destroying microorganisms to hybrid seed. Genetic control is very interesting in my opinion because when we look at things like plant varieties that are naturally resistant to insects, you have to think about the fact that you're never going to have to put any insecticides on those plants to protect them. So in my mind, that's good. So a lot of times we plant things for certain reasons, and in this case, we'd be trying to plant something where we don't need to use insecticides, which in the long run is better for the environment as a whole. Genetic control has been widely used in the past and may be an effective tool in the future, especially when combined with new gene manipulation techniques. Bacillus thuringiensis Bt, corn and potatoes, and herbicide-resistant corn, e.g. Roundup Ready corn and Liberty Link corn, cotton, e.g. Roundup Ready cotton, and soybean, e.g. Roundup Ready soybean, are examples of genetic control. The plant is genetically modified through molecular techniques to add a small amount of genetic material from other organisms. The incorporated genetic traits provide protection from pests, e.g. Bt crops produce a protein that kills caterpillars, tolerance to herbicides, or an improvement in quality. Something about this that you may already have picked up on is when we talk about these different types of crops we're growing here, such as Roundup Ready corn and the other things listed. The point is, these are genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. You've probably already heard about these in the news. A lot of people don't even want to eat these foods. They think it's bad to eat a GMO. The debate's still open on this. I do think there's been a lot of advances and a lot of good things with GMOs protecting these plants and crops. The issue is that does it affect humans adversely? So you're going to find a lot of information on both sides. I'm not going to cover that today, but I did want you to get introduced to genetic control and start to understand that there's a lot of things we can do with genetic control that really helps us out in the pest management industry. Let's talk about mechanical physical control. Mechanical and physical controls can kill a pest directly or make its environment unsuitable. Rodent traps are examples of mechanical control. Several types of traps are commonly used. Some kill animals that come across them, others snare animals that are then relocated or destroyed. Traps can be mechanical devices or sticky surfaces, some with pheromones incorporated to increase trapping efficiency. We have a very simple example here of a mechanical control, obviously, when we talk about rodent traps, which is a good thing for you to understand. Once again, if you're going to be taking any exams related to the Corps, you're going to have questions on mechanical control most of the time. Now, rodent traps are a simple way, and it's a good thing that most of us that have been in pest control definitely have used throughout our career. Now, these traps can be mechanical devices or sticky surfaces, which is very interesting because a lot of some people, when they deal with rats and mice, like the traps. Other people like what we call the glue traps or the sticky surfaces. I also like the idea with pheromones incorporated in these. So I've used a lot of different pheromone traps, especially related to things like Indian meal moths. They can be very effective because they're a good sticky trap. Now, you do put a pheromone scent in there to attract them, but at the end of the day, when you use a good pheromone, the sticky traps can be very effective for the different insects and pests. Physical controls include mulches for weed management, steam soil sterilization for disease control, deer fences, screens to keep insects out, and cloth mesh to exclude birds from fruit trees. Another example is sealing cracks and crevices and other small openings in buildings to exclude insects, rodents, bats, birds, and squirrels. A band of sticky material painted around tree trunks prevents crawling insects from reaching the tree's leaves. When it comes to physical controls, I'm going to say those of you that haven't even worked in pest management would totally understand things like the mulches for weed management and flower beds, but also things like the cloth mesh to exclude birds from fruit trees. How many of you have driven around and seen an orchard or something like that where you had the mesh over the trees protecting the fruit? It's a very interesting thing. I remember seeing it as a kid long before I was in pest management and often wondering, what is that for? Is that to keep the sun away from the trees? Now I understand, like a lot of you do, that actually excludes the birds from eating the fruit. Now, another example of sealing cracks and crevices and doing exclusion work, that's a really big deal as well. The more you're in pest control, the more you're going to understand this type of exclusion work, whether it's sealing a plumbing pipe going into a structure, or even when you get into bigger exclusions for bats, birds, or rats, squirrels, whatever it may be, you're going to find big holes. Sometimes you have the roof returns up on a roof that need to be sealed. And if these areas aren't sealed up, you can put out poisons and addicts. You can do a lot of different things. But the reality is you've got to use exclusion work to stop things from getting in. I learned a long time ago, even on ant services, I could caulk cracks outside around windows. I could caulk areas like plumbing pipes coming in. I could stop a lot of the problems without putting out a lot of pesticides. If they have a superhighway coming into the structure, doesn't matter if it's an insect, a rodent, whatever it may be, they're going to work their way in pretty easy. So if we don't shut off their pathways, we're kind of working against ourselves in solving these problems. Pests living in enclosed areas may sometimes be suppressed by altering physical and environmental conditions, such as water, air movement, temperature, light, and humidity. Refrigeration, for example, protects stored food products, furs, and other items from insect pests. Lowered temperatures kill the insects, cause them to stop feeding, and prevent egg hatch or development. Installing bright lights in attics sometimes discourages bats from roosting there. Lowering the humidity of stored grains and other food products reduces damage from molds and some insects. Increasing air movement in greenhouses often helps to prevent fungal diseases from developing on plants. When we talk about altering physical and environmental conditions, it's very important to look at what that means. Like it says here with refrigeration, we're keeping lower temperatures. We're keeping our foods and things in there where insects don't feed, where they can't lay their eggs, where they can't develop. So this basically is suppressing the insects. And again, just looking at the bottom here, where it talks about increasing air movement in a greenhouse to prevent fungal diseases from developing on plants, that doesn't seem like much, but that small alteration can stop these fungal diseases from spreading, and that's a really big deal in a greenhouse. You definitely don't want to lose all your plants. So it's a small alteration that makes a very big difference. Let's take a look at regulatory control. Some pest problems cannot be controlled successfully at a local level or by individuals. These problems are caused by pests that seriously endanger public health or are likely to cause widespread damage to agricultural crops or animals, forest, or ornamental plants. Quarantine or eradication programs directed by governmental agencies, according to federal and state laws, target the introduction and spread of such pests. So these types of regulatory controls you would understand would be like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or your Department of Agriculture in your state. And they would look at things on a more mass scale than somebody who's more local. They would look at things like quarantines and how to prevent certain things from spreading before they become a major issue.